So, good evening again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Maya Vardraj. I am a lead educator at Poster House, and I'm also a member of Poster House's CMYK Council. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few notes on accessibility for the event. Automated closed captioning is available for those who need it, and you can turn it on at the bottom of your screen with the CC button, and the program will also be recorded and made available on YouTube after the event. If you have any questions during the program, you can drop your questions in the chat like we've been chatting right now. You can also use the Q&A box at any time. So the way we're going to format questions is that once you ask them, I will vocalize them at the end of the program when we go into our Q&A section. When you're using the chat, like I told you before, make sure that it's set to everyone and not just hosts and panelists so that everyone can see your question. And I will vocalize it from there. And now that we've gone through accessibility, if you're not familiar with Poster House, it is the first and only museum in the United States dedicated to the art and history of the poster. I am super proud to work at Poster House, and I'm even more proud to host programs like the one we have tonight. And without further ado, we're getting into our tonight's program led by the esteemed Leo Vicenti. Leo is an assistant professor of communication design at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. He received a BA in graphic design from Fort Lewis College before completing an MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Yeah, I went there too. In visual communication design and a BA in graphic design from Fort Lewis College. Sorry, we said that before. His current research approaches indigenous language preservation and revitalization in typography and representation in the design field. Today, Leo is presenting the history and experience of the Apache through visual culture. Take it away, Leo.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for the introduction and welcome everyone. It's glad to see some familiar faces in the crowd. And yeah, I'm glad that you were able to make it today. I'm coming in from the West Coast. I know we have Poster House, which is situated here in New York, of course, which is across the continent from us. And yeah, I'm happy to get into both the presentation today, and we'll also have time for discussions afterwards. In talking with Poster House, we had a couple ideas in terms of like how to put together content. And being that, I'm most familiar with my own community and where I'm coming from, it kind of made sense to put together a program that kind of like situated in that space. But I think being the individual that I am, I think there's also a really interesting history and through line in the content that's going to be shared today. So I've put this together for you, and yeah, I think it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Uh, Part of because we were first trying to offer this a couple weeks ago. One of the big changes in that is that I was really just trying to refine a lot of the examples and the references that I was or had been collecting for the past year. And so one thing that I really got into is these kind of like deep dives and rabbit holes. And so instead of like trying to kind of like go further into those rabbit holes, I've tried to kind of situate it so it makes sense to kind of have these uh, kind of threads that come off of this storyline. But yeah, I wanted to start you with this image. This is actually an acrylic painting that was created by my grandfather on my father's side. His name's Carl Vicenti, which you can see his signature on the bottom left of this composition. It's fitting as both a beginning into what community life was growing up in northern New Mexico, and it's also a fitting kind of like ending to as well as we head into kind of more issues with representation in terms of like visual representation. So Um, we can think about that as we're finishing up the talk as well. But I think it's a great composition, and being that I'm not actually in New Mexico right now, it's also nice for me to kind of like situate myself there as I get started. Um, all right. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the unceded territories. Sorry. Where I work, including those of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and Stalo nations, also known as Vancouver, and also including the Semiahmoo Nation where I live. I'd like to state that our work and studies as artists, designers, and educators are deeply influenced by the values, tenets, and perspectives of the peoples of this land. In acknowledging the territory, we are stating that we have responsibilities, reciprocities, and commitments to this land that we now call home. Unceded means that First Nations people never ceded or legally signed away their lands to the Crown or to Canada, and Aboriginal people in BC assert that most of BC remains unceded sovereign native lands, over which neither the Canadian nor BC governments have the legal or moral authority to govern. Traditional territory is a geographic area identified by a First Nation as a land and or their ancestors traditionally occupied and used. It's a little interesting because like I'm living in Canada now, so you know, it's interesting to take that into the context of this talk. I also welcome you guys to include, the host nations where you guys are also joining as well. They mentioned, my name is Leo Vicenti. I'm a member of the Jicarilla Apache Nation, which is a federally recognized tribe. I am an active community member, so I do go back every year and try and participate and support as much as I can. But I currently hold the role of assistant professor of communication design, and then also held a MFA in visual communication design, a bachelor's in graphic design. Um, and a lot of the work I'm doing right now is in type design, really centered around indigenous language support through typography. And then I also, in addition to that, I do practice-based research and exhibition design. And kind of like educational, I guess, trajectory, I've had the opportunity to be and been exposed to a lot of different perspectives. So I think those are some things that we can also kind of like delve into as we go further. Um, but yeah, if you're not familiar, I'm from originally from New Mexico. If you look at the top uh, of this kind of like state. We have the Hickory Apache Reservation, and even though this is isolated, we can also acknowledge that Mexico to the south, Texas to the east, Oklahoma Panhandle, Kansas to the east, also to the north we have Colorado, Utah, and then Arizona as well. So New Mexico is really diverse, and it's also been really diverse, like historically too, as well. So, um, as we go further into the content, it's good to kind of see the full context, as there are like relationships historically, and relationships and connections. So I think that's a really interesting part of looking into this further. Um, in first talking, I think it's fair to really discuss um, Poster House and their approaches to um, kind of funding, and there's a really distinct way that they're defining posters. And so part of me starting this research, you know, where I'm including some posters, but I'm also kind of like looking at broader formats and expressions in this space. So, knowing that posters, uh, are really attuned to mass communication and persuasion, it's mentioning here the intersection of art and commerce and control of the public domain, or in general, like the communication aspects of that. But I think what I'm really getting at is that in looking at and addressing this, it's a bit complex, and maybe building out a larger kind of like holistic perspective and how we're looking at not only posters, but like how those kind of like elements get or are transferred or transform or spread to other formats, which is yeah, it's an interesting kind of phenomenon and how that happens. Um, but as you all know, a poster is a large sheet that is placed either in a public space to promote something or on a wall as a decoration. Typically, posters include both textual and graphic elements, although a poster may be either wholly graphical or wholly typographic. And they're designed to be both eye-catching and informative, and it may be used for multiple purposes as well, such as advertisements, propaganda, protesting, or like I mentioned, communicating a message. Um, the the rise of posters was really influenced by technology, and that the reproducibility of the artwork made it more accessible. And so, with the rise of printing in the 1840s and 50s, now we have exposure to a lot of different posters. Um, yeah, so 1840s and 1850s, we can also look in different like realms in that space. So printing in Europe versus like printing in the United States as well. Um, so in like analyzing like the concept that I was putting together, I was thinking about these contexts. So I wasn't just thinking about, how posters are actually occurring in like Europe versus the United States, but more I was thinking about building these contexts around where looking at the politics, the time, the culture, the bodies, and those contexts and then the subjects that actually happen within that as well. So there's a relationship between those two. And when we look at posters, I think what I'm trying to move away from is like looking at posters as in terms of the subject of an output of technology in relationship to like commercialism or consumer consumption. So in a very simple relationship, um, we can look at those two, but we can also look at a broader idea of that. And so those were things that as I was going through and collecting um, examples to kind of showcase, I had these kind of perspectives in mind. Um, a big part of this program is kind of the educational aspects. So looking at visual literacy in terms of like aesthetics. So as we look at some of the examples, we can pick out like applications of typography, use of imagery, use of graphic elements, color and format. I also want to encourage like the critical thinking aspects where we've talked about technology, but we can also talk about place and where is this occurring and by what culture. And then also the communication that's actually happening. So, we talk about naming, but we can also talk about the content that's actually happening in those examples too as well. So it's really interesting as you delve deeper into those kind of like threads. In terms of the context, looking at these in their specific kind of bubbles, so politics and cultures, specific communities, and how that is something that we can further understand these examples. And then one last thing that I actually thought to think about is like motives, abilities, and associations. So in creating all of these elements, what would be the motive of that and the ability for, certain communities to easily reproduce or produce these elements and then those associations. So I think some of the associations are really interesting as we see these as kind of like I mentioned, threads um, deviating from this kind of main storyline. Um, and then for me, like I'm a designer, so I think it's interesting to kind of like see this and work through this as someone who like creates images and creates typography, where I don't really show a lot of that, but I'm putting this together in terms of like how I'm thinking about it myself as a designer who's working within design. Um, one of the big things that I don't want to like do is come at this as like from a critical perspective where I'm a design historian who's not operating as a designer or a design critic who's operating outside of design. So I think there's a lot of power in that where as a designer, I'm the one that makes these choices and I can also synthesize and also communicate like why am I doing these or why do I take on projects? And I think in terms of representation, it's really important to be coming from that space. So even though I am critical of the things that I'm including, um, I can also use those images and turn them around as I please. So I think that's one thing that I'm trying to work through as a designer. So um, being in that place, I have an understanding of the design histories. I also further refining like my design criticality. So I think with these in mind, I was putting together this kind of like design narratives that I'm going forward, which I think it's a really good approach to, think of as you start working with like cultural communities. And me being a member of those communities too, as well, which is really important. I like to share these images because these are pictures of my grandmother. So Lydia Posada, who's she's you know the matriarch of our family. I was really exposed to traditional arts growing up, and so I think that was something that really impacted my trajectory. Where working either in uh, those capacities. Um, those are things that I really got exposed to growing up. So exposure to uh, micaceous pottery, fabrication, and then sumac and willow basketry too as well. So I think those are things that I'm really appreciative of, coming of where I am. And I also think it's just something that I constantly return to, especially as I navigate, kind of representation uh, in my work, right, as a designer. One of the first uh, kind of instances that I remember coming into this place, right, in terms of like the graphic arts or visual arts, is this character right here. So I have a really distinct memory of growing up in Dulce, where I lived for the large part of my life. And I had just learned how to bike. I had a bike the year before, and so I would ride my bike around town with my brother. And so one of those things in that bike riding kind of approach is that during the summer we have a festival in Dulce, and which I'll go into further here. But essentially, the story is that I saw my uncle, who he was an artist too as well, and he was painting this character on a large piece of plywood. And so I actually stopped and I went to visit and just see what he was up to. And I didn't really ever think about it up until that point in my life. So I was, I had never really recognized this character. And it's a big staple in our community too as well. And so it's something that it has deep roots in the community, but in terms of representation, there's also like, things that might not be totally like right in that relationship. But yeah, it's the beginning of this kind of like story that I'm trying to thread. And here's kind of a further example of that. So this is a flyer, or it's not a poster, it's probably a flyer. So this is a letter size flyer that was put out for the Little Beaver celebration. So this character is celebrated every year after mid-July, after the 4th of July celebrations. And so it's common for a lot of communities, indigenous communities in the States to have these celebrations. And so it's not too far off that you would see specific iterations like these coming from uh, cultural indigenous communities all over the states. So I think that's really interesting in terms of like having opportunities or creating events to design. And yeah, it is a really it's something that's there's a lot of power in the community to create these things. Like right now, I think with the democratization of media, it makes it a lot easier to produce these things. And yeah, they might be printed. A lot of things are actually being developed in the digital realm right now. So I think that's an interesting place that we can kind of like note as we're going forward in these kind of like powwow events. Um, Another one that I want to actually showcase too as well, which I actually pulled this from the People's Graphic Design Archive website. So there's a whole group of these from the University of Oregon annual Mother's Day powwow posters that were compiled and collected and submitted by Sophie Katie. I know these were ones that they popped up in social media a little while ago, but I think Sophie Katie did a really good job in curating these where there's a lot of similarities between what we're looking at here um, for this year's, right, Little Beaver Powwow, where this is actually occurring in 2009. But in terms of like visual elements, you can see a similar approach and probably that same like navigation in terms of the design processes. But going back to the narrative is that for me to understand this character of Little Beaver, I really had to get a little bit older, and I also recall those dates when we were actually leaving town and going north to Pagosa Springs. So this character is Red Rider. Some of you might know him. He occurs in a lot of different media. But right here, I think the importance of this, as we read at the bottom underneath the Red Rider Roundup, is that this actually occurs in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. So if we're going back to the map earlier, north of the state of New Mexico is Colorado, and Pagosa Springs is actually 45 minutes north of Dulce, where I'm from. So um, in understanding where that character comes from, I really had to go to Pagosa Springs and being able to kind of get exposed to this uh complementary character, right, that happens in Pagosa Springs. And this poster is actually from this year, so this is from 4th of July celebration this year. Um, the one from last year in 2023, you can better see that alignment of, Little Beaver and Red Rider, this kind of like, main Caucasian cowboy character and his like Native American sidekick. So I think as I got older, I was really able to understand what that is and that relationship. Um, Pagosa Springs is so close to Dulce, but also I think there's something that you almost don't have a way to get out of this. Like, so, growing up, there was individuals who participated in the pageants. There was a powwow, there was a rodeo. There was all kinds of events and activities that were going on. And being from a really small town like Dulce, it was kind of the events and festivities to actually partake in. So it was interesting growing up, and I still think, in terms of representation, those are things that I was still, as an artist or a designer, like, how do I work past this? Um, but yeah, interesting space. And like I mentioned, um, just showing the map here. So Dulce, which is at the center of the screen, that horizontal line that's split it is actually the New Mexico Colorado border. But also you can see our reservation, which is the Jicarilla Apache Nation. The other rectangular shape is the Southern Ute Reservation, and then farther to the east or to the west, I'm saying, is the Navajo Nation. So in looking at Pagosa Springs as kind of like a center to this character and to this narrative, we're really in close proximity to these other indigenous communities in this kind of like northern New Mexico environment. Um, and Fred Harmon, who is actually the illustrator for this comics, his museum was actually housed in Pagosa Springs as he lived there for quite a while. The museum is actually closed as of 2019. But I did find he does have a website that covers the Fred Harmon art kind of practice. And there's still a lot of things that you can find, and which I'll touch on some of those too as well. But Fred Harmon, he was born in Missouri originally in 1902, and his father had previously homesteaded in Pagosa in 1891. And I'm taking this from his website that his life really began in the land of cowboys and Indians, what with the Utes, Apaches, and Navajos living in the same proximity as the ranchers. And in this, you can see, him actually at his drafting table and laying out these compositions for comics to be, printed as he's, it's been a long practice of his. Um, in looking at this, I started actually getting really interested in these timelines. So in having his father having homesteaded in Pagosa in 1891, one of the things that I was looking at is that, our tribe had actually been created with an executive order that was signed by President Grover Cleveland on February 11th, 1887. So the logo on the left at the bottom of the reservation plot, you can see that February 11th, 1887. But there's actually two different, and there's an older seal to the right where that date actually changes to 1937, which is a signifier of the organization of a formal government and adopted constitution. But the difference between, the creation of the reservation and the homesteading with his father is actually just a mere 4 years. So between his father homesteading in Pagosa Springs, 4 years prior, we were finally establishing ourselves as um, a reservation. And then it still took, some, 40 plus years to actually make us uh, organize a formal government too, as well. So I think that kind of like timeline things were things that I was really looking at. Um, yeah, and if we go like further or broader and look broader in terms of like the timeline, we have Spanish colonization from 1492 to 1898. So that's a large period. Um, I think through this kind of like snapshot, I'm really looking at imperialism, colonialism, and war. I know I wanted to actually note the Pueblo Revolt, which occurred in 1680, right? But there's also elements like the Indian Wars, which encapsulated the Apache Wars, um, and um, the central timelines at the bottom central, I'm really just outlining Western expansion. And so, amongst all this, if we're looking at that 1887 or 1937 um, government establishment, that actually happens further along, but not so far along from all of these things that are occurring in Western expansion. So I think that was really interesting where um, that's not so far, not so long ago. I think in doing the math, I think that's like 80 plus years ago, which those are things that my grandparents and my great grandparents had experienced. Um, the first kind of like research that I delved into was actually looking at the Library of Congress. So I was just curious on like what I would find, where this is going into the 1800s. This actual example that I pulled from the Weekly National Intelligencer in Washington, was actually highlighting New Mexico in 1850. So around that same time, if we're looking at all these dates, we're looking at that time as a time of manifest destiny, but also Western expansion. Um, and I wanted to include more pieces in this. And what I was doing as I was going through this is I was just using that word Apache and the name Apache. And I all the results on the right were different hits that I found as I was going through the Library of Congress. So just looking at newspapers, you can see the different events as we, consider, the Indian Wars or the Apache Wars. Um, Here, where I've highlighted Apache on that next line, you can actually see uh, the mention of my tribe, the Jicarillas, within the limits of these settlers that are occurring in the New Mexico area. But going back to, Fred Harmon, he was actually, doing work as a commercial artist. So he was doing a lot of work similar to what might be like graphic design later on. But he's also really talented as an illustrator. This is actually a snapshot of him at the City Film Ad Company. And so he actually worked along with Walt Disney at that time. At some point, they actually had a company, a small company that they had started, which and it was never successful, and they actually had to not pursue that anymore. But I think that was one thing that within this research, knowing who his contemporaries are, and of course, like what Disney chose to do, and how he chose to go about representation in those projects, in that catalog. The first comic that Fred Harmon had done was done by Brock Peeler. That was the first character, which is on the top left. I couldn't find a lot of references for this, but I know that Brock Peeler was, the precedent for what we were going to see in the Red Rider and in Little Beaver. It wasn't until 1938 when he met Stefan Schlesinger, who was an author but also a promoter, and he was also really elemental in buying like rights for a lot of different like projects at that time. So the King of the Royal Mounted, that's one of the examples where he this is original works that he supported through Zane Grey, but there's also other projects that he took on that weren't original, but he continued to buy the rights from. So I know that Winnie the Pooh, which was coming out around that same time, he was working on making that more of like an experience and making it more of a an endeavor that could create money for that business that they were developing. But Red Rider, his first appearance actually came in 1939 through Crackerjack Funnies. So the example that we're looking at the left, this was the first kind of like exposure that we were seeing, which is coming after, as I was saying, Brock Peeler at that time. So, in teaming up with Stephen Schlesinger, Stephen Schlesinger really played the art the author part in that relationship. So, he had this kind of like ongoing narrative of who Red Rider would be, and then Fred Harmon was primarily the illustrator for that. And so Crackerjack Funnies was the first instance, but yeah, soon after that, the Red Rider kind of tandem came into play. And then within that Rider kind of like timeline, we see more prominent central comics that are focusing on Little Beaver. Um, so I think this is really interesting. Um, I found a lot of examples of these. So, if this is something that interests you, there's quite a bit of comics out there. Um, And yeah, if I'm just looking at like the little beaver as a subject, those are also things that, I'm constantly seeing like new iterations or new kind of like content that's coming out or reworked. So um, really interesting to kind of like being able to map this to present and to share. Part of that Red Rider I guess like aggregate of that experience is there was also a radio show that was part of it. So in 1942, the Red Rider radio program aired for a whole year in 1942, where I know that there was pretty frequent editions, and there's a whole cast of characters that actually played into that as well. So radio was a big aspect, and I couldn't find a lot of like visual references for that, but that's also you can still find clips of those programs available, readily available. Um, Another perspective of this, which there's so much examples that I could have pulled and showed as well, but I just chose to kind of like look at both film and TV. So splitting it into three different areas, we see Republic Pictures putting out a lot of TV program, or these are actually films focusing on the Red Rider, and some of them actually include Little Beaver. So it goes from Republic Films onto Eagle Lion Films, and then Telecom, which those are actually TV programs. Um, and looking through them, I just pulled these from the Republican Pictures, but you can see in each of those compositions, we see that central role of Red Rider, and then these kind of like sidekick cameos of Little Beaver and who is being played in those projects as well. There was something about, looking at and pulling up all of these. I think, stylistically and looking at the design, there's definitely an aesthetic and possibly things, working in terms of like color and processing that as a designer or a commercial artist. So, um, again, like if this interests you, there's a ton more of resources that are available out there. Um, I think at one point I wanted to kind of like try and acquire like posters, but there was just so much work. I couldn't imagine acquiring all of these works. Or even I think the challenge too is also being able to talk to each one of these, where each of these has their own kind of like timelines and different dealings with specific characters or communities in those projects. To expand on that aggregate too, we also have a whole range of products. So toys, novelties, gifts, accessories, sporting goods, as we know, clothing, school supplies, and lunch kits. Uh, Interesting enough, JCPenney had a whole collaboration with this project. So you could find in JCPenney's these Red Rider corrals where you can find school supplies and clothing and lunch kits for uh, your child, which I've pulled a couple examples right here that we can look at. But I think yeah, it's a really interesting space, and of course you can see at the bottom of this central image that Fred Harmon actually, he drafted that, and that's something that he played a big part in going forward. Um, I just recently, within the past couple years, being in Vancouver, I was recently exposed to through my own like research, looking at the works of Shigeru Sugi. I'm sorry, I'm butchering this. Sugiura. And so, he was an comic artist, and the reason that I found it was from this publication called 10 Cent Manga. So they focus on different comics that were occurring, and so they're showcasing this specific project, which is called The Last of the Mohicans. Um, I thought this was really interesting because I actually noticed the book before the book cover, which is on the left, it looks so familiar to me that I actually had to pick up the book and look at it closer. But that conflict of the Last of the Mohicans, which is, a different narrative, and then the narrative that I understand and come to know, which is the Red Rider and Little Beaver narratives, they were actually in conflict. So, and then if we're looking at the image to the right, I was actually you know understanding that of like this is such a weird like parallel world, and how do I understand that? But putting them together here, we can understand like this kind of like cultural crossovers. And with the Last of the Mohicans, it was something in that same realm where in, the 1940s, 1950s, these actual products were actually making way into Eastern Asia and being reworked by these comic artists to recreate these narratives and recreate new content and how they're approaching I want to say like Western expansion, but it could also just be like Westerns in general. I think there was a lot of interest in indigenous North Americans. I think there was a lot of interest in Westerns as well, and like Western fashion, Western culture, Western perspectives. So I think that was really a big influence in how we're seeing that cross-cultural exchange, and it kind of making, I guess, like full circle, right? And being taken to Eastern Asia and then also coming back to me, and seeing this as a whole new kind of like experience or a whole new look at that. So I think it was really interesting um, to kind of consider. Um, if we're looking at the timelines too, like the Last of the Mohicans was occurring in 1953. Um, a big part of that too, as we're seeing like cultural exchange in Eastern Asia, we can also see the cultural exchange going east to Europe. And so, spaghetti westerns, which are really encapsulated in this 1960 to 1970 period, a lot of these really occurred in Italy. And so those are things that, if we're looking both ways and looking at the globe holistically, we can see that there's also cultural exchange happening in that area too as well. One of the main things that really came up is this other character, Winnetou. So Winnetou is a fictional Native American hero of several novels written by written in German by the German Karl May. So he was one of the best-selling German writers of all time, with about 200 million copies worldwide, including the Winnetou trilogy. And the character made his debut in the novel Old Firehand, which was published in 1875. The interesting thing, as I delved further into this, is Karl May actually never visited or been to, the continent of the Americas. So I think it was really interesting to kind of find out that all of these narratives and stories that he had put together were actually things that he created through his imagination or through his exposure to media or newspapers, coming into Germany, and him working or reworking those narratives and reworking those perspectives to actually fit within a German context. I know that yeah, there might be some kind of like problematic things in that. But if we actually go into like Germany, there's actually a big appreciation for indigenous North American cultures. So I think that was one thing that was really uh, complex. And it was also for me, um, it's a hard thing to kind of understand of like how um, you know that's occurring, and it kind of gets it gets a little like pushed far. So I think one of my main takeaways of that is really like the creation of like a pan-indigenous kind of like identity. And so um, you know, those are things that I'm kind of like pulling out as I'm kind of like experiencing and understanding this better. But here are the first couple book cover designs that I was able to pull. And you can see, these are have their own kind of like aesthetic in terms of like book design. Of course, we also know that these are in English too as well, so we can also assume that there's also um, additional and alternate versions published in German as well. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to get really clear examples that I could share with you today. Um, Within all of this, I think one of the big things was just like the romance in this, and so I wanted to include this, but also just speaking to that romanticism that we're seeing both in like uh, the cultural exchange into Eastern Asia, but also this romance and like taking this into like Italy and spaghetti westerns, and the romanticism that I can't like really help to like walk around. And you can see this in some of a lot of these different projects. And yeah, I think it's also an interesting like thread to kind of acknowledge as well, where these are actually movie stars, movie characters, and we can see, how that plays out in some of those projects. Um, but film, where these actually are movie posters, you can see the actual variation too as well, as they're actually produced and reproduced for different uh, languages in these. But um, I pulled these ones out knowing that these are actually both like typographic approaches too as well. So I thought that was really interesting where we have iterations where we're using like more character-based subjects and that are actually showing more of a image. Where these ones, the compositions are purely, Western wood type style typography, and the use of typography in text as a very direct visual element in these posters. Um, I probably spent like way too much time just like searching the internet and prowling for all of these. So if this is something that really interests you, I do encourage you to take on some research and to look. What I found really interesting in this is that I think it's the sixth image on the top here. They just re-released Winnetou and the Old Shatterhand just recently. So there's a whole new like reimagining of this world that was just re-released and reproduced as well. So I think in terms of like that experience aggregate, we have the full circle coming around where we're taking it over and we're remaking it, and it's not a book anymore, and it's not the first round of movies. It's actually a second round of like re-envisioned movies. So I think that was really interesting to kind of see. Um, I guess capitalism and commercialism really turn full on, and that there is interest in these spaces, and that it actually is very interesting to cultures still, and interesting to communities and individuals. And this is the space where we can talk about also that cultural exchange where these are spaghetti westerns also not only getting shared within the continent of North America, but also making their way further east or west, right? So of course the poster which I chose to showcase this talk being showcased in Japanese, and then yeah, I think the two different iterations uh really interesting to see how this is kind of becoming a global perspective, and how global audiences are actually taking to this. Um, but yeah, I think for me it's such a strange mixture of content, of characters, locations, of narratives, coming from, if I'm going back to Dulce, where I would, have a lot of my influence in my life, this becomes a very like jumbled like mishmash of all these kind of like different influences. And so I think that was uh, really strange to me as I was kind of like experiencing this. Of course, that it's also a capitalistic and commercial like endeavor. So Winnetou is also realized in a lot of different formats, including comics. And yeah, there's a whole range in terms of like, if we're talking about visual communication or communication design or graphic design, we have these different applications going on and how there's iterations and different motives and different applications and outputs for that. One of those being puzzles. So I knew I wanted to kind of like show what that could be as we were looking at, Little Beaver's kind of shoebox earlier. The puzzle is also a really interesting thing and very image based. Um, there was a point where I had the opportunity to go to Germany for study abroad, and I actually had the opportunity to visit the Karl May Museum, which I'm spacing on which actual town it is, but I believe it was in Red Bull, Germany. And so this is the actual museum sign that you can see outside of the house. The museum is a converted house that Carl May used to live in, and so he used to live there, and it has now become the museum for uh, archival purposes for all of these works, but also more, as we'll see. Being able to kind of like walk into this space in Germany, right, as an Apache man, um, it was just such a crazy experience, and showing some of these examples, but also knowing that the people in that community are really really supportive, and this is a really popular project. Um, I'm able to kind of like see these firsthand, right? Where we can see, of course, this Apache Gold poster, but uh, the whole property is just full of these kind of like cues, and so it really is just a rich kind of like immersion into like all of these things. Um, the reason that I picked this example is because like in reading and looking at the visual elements, I started to think more about like the actual language that was being used. And so right here we can look at greed, violence, and savagery. And so those are things that, as a character in a movie, those are also like applied to communities, right? Like I'm a real person, and there's a number of Apache bands in the States, and those are things in terms of representation that I also wanted to highlight that this is how we're being conveyed, and yeah, and it becomes such a deep um, understanding at that point, I think. Um, but to kind of like further step or walk through this place, we have dioramas um, that are including, some of these storylines and some of these subjects. We have interactives too, where this is one where you could actually, pull back the face, and you can actually put and frame your own face within this interactive to take a photo. So photo ops. Um, One of the most surprising things that I actually ran into was that this installation specifically, where we're showcasing Apache regalia, and so I I can, as we study like visual culture more, I was able to kind of look at the similarities, but also I distinctly identify this cape to the left. So you have these kind of like alternating like blue and white lines. Those are actually things that if we're looking at like material culture or visual culture, those cues actually tune us into like that specific community. And they weren't like shying away from this either as well. So if you look at the actual museum label, you can see that this is actually a Jicarilla Apache cape, right? And so those kind of discussions about repatriation, right, and the taking of cultural patrimony, right, across country line or yeah, across country lines or internationally, where we have no power in bringing articles like this back home because you know programs like NAGPRA, which is the Native American uh, Graves Repatriation Act, those don't actually have any power internationally. So there's no way that we can actually return these, um, bodies back home. So that was really surprising and kind of tragic to kind of like run into and shocking a bit. But it wasn't just that. I think things like these, where these are actually a real headdress, right? And you can recognize that there's no knowing like what community this came from or how these objects even like made their way into Germany, right? Or made their way into this guy Karl May's museum house. So I think that those are really interesting uh, things to kind of think of going forward in terms of like repatriation. But also, the surprising thing is like when I tried to talk to the museum kind of operators, they all of a sudden don't speak English, right? And and there's no way to communicate like how I talk further with them about this. So, um, yeah. But Karl May, they do offer a festival yearly. And so, this was in 13 in Raid Bull, where I have the signage. And they also offer, if we're talking and returning back to the powwow posters, right? They also are promoting and have their own powwow that they create too as well. Um, from my understanding, they invite individuals and they fly them from the states to actually perform in front of these kind of communities. And then there's also individuals from the community who dress up and play Indian too as well. So it's a really interesting environment and a really interesting context that they're operating within. The last kind of like theme that I'm pulling from this is really returning to the language and to the naming of this. I think part of this is just that Apache name and those kind of like connotations that are attached to that. So we have movies like The Last Apache or Apache featuring Burt Lancaster, right? And those kind of things where we're using that name, it couldn't be something that I couldn't like touch on. And it brings up kind of like perspectives where the Dene or the Navajo Nation, they've also dealt with those things in the past. But what is also that in our own context, right? I know that the Navajo Nation had actually trademarked the name, right? So it couldn't be used. And I think to myself, like, what if we had done that, right? And what if we take charge and take control of that content or that name, so that it can't be really um, misused going forward. So I think those are really interesting kind of like dialogues to kind of think about. But um, again, with like movie posters, there's a ton of different like instances, not only in the naming of uh, the actual films, but the characters and the subjects within those films. I didn't include a lot of movies because I'm looking at like the surface level, but if I go even deeper, right, there's a lot of movies that actually feature like Apaches that are actually just like villains in these films. So the examples that I'm showing here are just the kind of like surface level of like a much deeper discussion or dialogue on like how we're being villainized. But yeah, I think if we're also looking at it in terms of like visual literacy, right? We can talk about the language, we can talk about the use of imagery, the use of typography, and how those might actually communicate specific things. Other examples including Apache Territory, Apache Warrior, the massacre at Fort Apache. We're still seeing like cross-cultural exchange. And yeah, I've been looking through all this content for over a year, but the things that I'm able to pull forward or pull out, it's always surprising to me. Of course, loteria is also something that it's surprising because I actually saw this when I was living in Chicago, where we were talking about Chicago earlier. I'm pulling these out from these kind of travels that I am having as I'm pursuing education, right? And then the namesake for this presentation, an Apache Odyssey, which is actually a book. Within my looking through the library and looking at multiple books, I think it's really interesting to kind of think of that where uh, I have thousands of images and going through those and returning to those images, the concept for this kind of like presentation was actually part of the content that I gleaned from just this research that I take on or continue to take on. Um, and I think, there's really obvious things like the Apache helicopter where this is done in honor of, right, of Apachean peoples, and what that means. And is that something that's, respectful? I'm not too sure. Um, right now I'm living in Canada, like I mentioned. I was actually in the process of crossing the border into Canada, and I saw this pop-up RV camper that's named an Apache, right, with a little roadrunner on there. So I think I'm becoming like not surprised as I run into more kind of like absurdities with the actual use of the name. Probably one of the most absurd is in Chicago, the Jewish Community Center actually have an Apache J camp, right? And these posters or kind of banners are actually um, promoted on the back of the CTA buses. So if you're riding a bus in Chicago, there's more than a likeliness that you've been exposed to this. Um, And yeah, I think one of the most unapparent things is like Apache is actually a software, right? It's an open source software too as well. So if you use a digital device like your laptop or your phone or your tablet, there's uh, a high likeliness that you're actually using an open source Apache software. And I've actually, been in talks with the Apache Software Corporation or the Apache Software Group, which is a nonprofit group about the rebranding of their name, right? So the example at the top, the Apache Spam Assassin, is something that they've since ditched, right, in their kind of romanticism of software and this kind of like new frontier of the digital space. But it also kind of brings up those thoughts of like, our usage or our presence in the digital space, right? And is that something that we move towards as we go forward? Where if you're looking at the hyperlink or the website link, this is apache.org. So if you're looking for more information, apache.org is your place to go. Um, yeah, and I think one thing, as we're, this is kind of my last note where it's both the content and the name of Apache, but it's also something I'm really critical of as a designer. So this is something that I teach in my design classes where you have this kind of like use of visual culture as it's integrated into typographic representations, where this is a work done by Angel Decora in the Indians book. But I don't feel like it really fits me too as well. And, I don't know if the Hopi or Dakota or Zuni actually fit within that same space. But as I'm looking at this kind of like illustration or lettering of Apache, I just don't feel like it fits my visual culture. And so I think that's one thing that, if Angel Decora was here today, she might have a different process, or it might be something where we don't choose to use like visual culture for, reuse or representation in current contemporary projects. But I think that's a really critical discussion to kind of like think about as a designer. And yeah, even for myself, I'm currently navigating this. So as a type designer, what does that look like? And how am I really engaging in like stereotypes? How am I engaging with discussions and discourse? And how is this a space for learning, right, with students? And how can that be something that can be foundations of design discourse as we go forward? Um, so yeah, I think this is kind of wrapping up my presentation. The last slide that I have for you is actually just a very simple geometric uh, typeface that I use. It's not for commercial sale, but it's something that I'm using to kind of teach about that kind of like stereotypes and homogenization or generalization of indigenous communities. But I do hope you guys had enjoyed my presentation. Of course, there's a lot more that can be shared, and there's a lot more out there. So if it is interesting to you, I definitely encourage you to keep digging deeper. And I hope you guys also have a great day after this.
Leo, thank you so much for such a robust conversation. I feel like we learned so much about visual culture and the way that it plays such a role in so many aspects of how we consume a culture, how we understand a culture from history to now. Um, and this typeface it's so beautiful. And I feel like it's yeah, I don't know what to say about it because there's so much to look at here. And I feel like it's complex and, like you said, simple at the same time. I want to open it up to our attendees for a second. If anyone has any questions or anything that they would like to share with Leo before we wrap up. I have some questions too, but I wanted to open it up to our attendees first. Any questions from anyone? Any thoughts, comments? Okay, Leo, do you think the use of AR with printed matter, such as a poster, could be a means to give viewers a deeper understanding of the Apache people, their visual culture, history, and current issues?
Sorry, I'm just seeing the question. Yeah. I uh I appreciate the question, Delve. I I'm not a big supporter of AR. That's augmented reality, right? Um, I think that there's uses in that. I'm just not too sure, what the role is in that technology. Um, I think that, a lot of museum contexts have been looking at augmented reality as a way to document visual culture and being able to create digital archives without actually needing to, uh, I guess, collect, right, or keep a collection. So I think those are interesting um, solutions, right, to kind of like a Western colonial practice.
Mhm.
Um, but I still think yeah, I'm not too sure in what role that looks like now. I think when I was navigating those kind of perspectives, I assume that there's been advances in technology, and I think that's one of the biggest things where um, AR might not be what it was back then, and it might be, there's constant developments in that. But I think, there are nice possibilities. I think if we're just looking at the visual elements, right? Because part of visual culture is looking at you know, other contexts and other things that we can read from a piece. I like that you uh, mentioned history, but how can we uh, interpret, current issues? I think some of that actually needs to be or have an individual or have an organization play that role of interpreter so that, even as a viewer to a museum, a lot of individuals or viewers who are experiencing that, they need that interpretation to fully understand it. And part of that interpretation is making clear the context of the work.
Thank you so much for that question, and Leo, for you answering it. Does anyone else have any questions, thoughts, comments on our program today?
Yeah, thank you, Dov.
Leo, I wanted to ask you, what are some things that young designers are looking at to sort of bring back a more appropriate representation of indigenous visual culture um, through typography or graphic design in general?
Yeah, I think you know, in a lot of programs, even showcasing how visual culture works, I think that's a big part in those programs. So understanding that, we're all coming from a culture and oftentimes multiple cultures.
Mhm.
So being able to navigate that, because um, we're all going to run into kind of like stereotypes.
Yes.
In this instance, we're looking at caricatures, right, and other figures. Um, once once we're in that kind of like research space, being able to understand what that means and then also how it might be perceived. So as a community member, this is how I understand things. But if I'm not from that community, I have to work that much harder to really understand. And so I think the work and in terms of the research, it has to be really extensive and really be so much that you can ensure like it's a responsible and a respectful approach to a project. But sometimes that's not maybe even a possibility without collaboration. I think a lot of the works that I was taking on in Chicago, right, is the Chicago hockey team. And so
Yes.
how do we navigate like designing in that context? And
Mhm.
so those are specific communities and that's a specific individual. And so I think it while it would be challenging, I think it might be worth it to kind of like change from those kind of like caricature style mascots to something that's more representative of who the individual was. So I think, yeah, sometimes, those little opportunities to make improvement, it might be worth taking on a project like that, but also there might not be opportunities to actually do the work if it's so complex. So I think it takes a little bit of a analysis and kind of like research to really understand the context of the place.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? What a wonderful program. I want to thank you again so much for bringing this knowledge and expertise to us in such an accessible way. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, your work, your perspectives. So I just want to say a big thank you to you and all our attendees. Um, We host programs like this at Poster House all the time. Please come back. And if you're ever in New York, come visit us. We love having people from all over the world. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite. And yeah, even though this is a program done for like Native American Heritage Month, I encourage all of the attendees to really, develop that deeper relationship with your indigenous communities. And yeah, I welcome you to also delve further into acting practitioners and creatives. I think what I covered today was more an overview and different things that are happening in the media. I think a follow-up presentation would include all of our Apache relatives who are actually working and creating things that actually counteract to what's going on in the media.
Absolutely. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. Have a wonderful rest of the week and night, and we'll see you all soon.
All right. Thank you.